Hi everyone, welcome back to Attacking and Defending Active Directory. Once again, we continue our discussion with persistence. Now we move on to persistence using ACLs. First, we'll have a look at admin SD holder. What is admin SD holder? Admin SD holder is a special container in the system container of a domain, which is used to control or protect or not protect, to control or hold the permissions for certain built-in privilege groups called the protected groups. Now, what does admin SD holder literally means? Admin security description or security descriptor holder. What does that mean? That means that admin SD holder maintains its own ACL or consider its own ACL to be the ACL for the protected groups. And every 60 minutes by default in a domain, there is a process called ST-prop or security descriptor propagator, which reads the ACL of the admin ST holder container and overrides the ACLs of all the protected groups by the ACL of the admin ST holder. So what does that mean? Let me show you that with an example. So what is admin SD holder? If we have go to the Active Directory users and computers, in the system container, you will find admin SD holder. Uh, so this is the ACL of the admin SD holder group, which is overwritten on all the protected groups every 60 minutes by default. That is, if someone modifies, let's say, the ACL of the domain admins group, within an hour, that ACL would be overwritten by this one. Right, we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's first have a look at what the protected groups are. So these are the protected groups: account operators, backup operators, server operators, print operators, domain admins, replicator, enterprise admins, domain controllers, read-only domain controllers, schema admins, and administrators, right? So on a forest route, you will have enterprise admins and schema admins. So these are the protected groups. Why these groups are protected, other than the domain admin and the enterprise admin and the domain controllers, which are all well-known powerful groups. Some other groups, why they are in the protected groups is because of this. These also are quite well known. For example, account operators. The account operators group cannot modify the built-in admins or the enterprise admins or the domain admins groups, but they have the ability to modify nested groups within these groups. What does that mean? That means, let's say you have a group called company administrators inside the domain admins group. The account operators group, anyone who is a member of the account operators group cannot modify the membership of the domain admins group, but it can modify the membership of the company administrators group. That is why it is considered a powerful group and hence a part of the protected groups. Similarly, backup operators can backup GPO, and it has the capability to add the GPO, which means we can add SID or SID of a controlled account to a privileged group and then restore the GPO, right? You back up a GPO, edit it, and then restore it, which is ripe for abuse, right? So that is what backup operators does. Server operators can run a command as system using the disabled browser service. Command as system on the domain controller. Print operators can copy ntds.dat, which holds all the secrets of the domain. It can also load device drivers. Right, so this is why we have protected groups. These groups are very sensitive and all powerful, right? So what happens in case of uh, admin SD holder? Let's have a look at this. So let me see if we have the invoke SD propagator here. Otherwise, I have to copy this. Okay, okay, it is right here. So let's say your domain was compromised and someone got a domain admin access. Now, a very popular or a very useful abuse could be to have privileges of domain admin without having a member of the domain admins group. right? Because the membership of the domain admins group is quite frequently audited. If we once we have domain admin privileges, if we add our user to the domain admins group, then that may be detected. So in place of that, what an attacker can do, or what the attackers used to do or still do, is to add their user. For example, I control student admin right now, so I provide the user full control over the domain admins group. Now, what does that mean? That means that without even being a member of the domain admins group, unless someone is auditing the ACLs, I can secretly add and remove users into this group, right? So I control the domain admins group without even being a part of it. So here you can see that we have the student admin with full control on the domain admins group. Now this is where the admin SD holder or the security propagation comes into play. If I run, so we can run it locally, but for the sake of demonstration, let's run it remotely. If I run as invoke SD propagator onto the domain controller, so this is with the domain admin privileges. So what we are doing right now, invoke SD propagator, that is a valid Windows process. We are just fasting it. We are just making it happen quick or fastening it up so that we can have a look at the solution, what SD propagation does without waiting for an hour. So I load invoke SD propagator here, and with the help of invoke command, or better, so that it is clear when we are abusing it and when we are using it, let me copy it to the domain controller. That way it would be easier to understand. So invoke SD propagator is here. I load the script, right? And if I run invoke SD propagator now, I need to copy the command. So let's run this. So what happens now when the SD propagator is executed? What happens is whatever is the ACL of the admin SD holder is, that is read, and ACL of all the protected groups is overwritten by this. That means here we have no student admin. That means if we go here and now check the ACL of the domain admins group, we should not see the student admin user here anymore, right? This is what SD propagation does. If anyone modifies the ACL of the protected group, it would be overwritten in an R by default, right? That is what SD propagator is. So this is the intended functionality of admin SD holder, right? Now, this is ripe for abuse, right? If you have not spotted it yet, think about it once again. The ACL of the admin SD holder container is overwritten onto all the protected groups ACL, right? And there is no check or protection. What does that mean? That means if we simply go here and add student admin, let's say here, we provide student admin full control over the ACL of the admin SD holder group, which we can, and then we run propagation, or we just leave it and the propagation is automatically executed. This ACL would be overwritten on all the protected groups. That is, if we now have a look at the ACL of the domain admins group, we can see that the student admin is right here, right? So this is very interesting, and really like this attack, because we have abused something which was specifically there to stop this abuse, right? So this way we abuse the admin SD holder ACL, we modify itself, and then it is overturned on all the protected groups. Right, so this is what the admin SD holder abuse is. Now what we are going to have a look at is how to do it remotely without an interactive logon or without going onto the domain controller. So let's remove this and run the propagation once again. So now let's have a look at how we can do it remotely. Once again, we are back to our two tools which we have been using, PowerView or the Active Directory module. Both of them can be used to abuse the domain admin privileges so that we can persist by modifying the ACL of the admin SD holder container. So in PowerView, we can use the add object ACL command. We'll have a look at both of the options. We can use add object ACL. What would be our target ADS prefix now for admin SD holder? Let's add it for student 1 or student admin, or when you're practicing it for your own user. If you're student 10, this should be student 10. Let's have a full control with verbosity turned on. In case of the Active Directory module, I wrote a script called set ADACL, which uses the Active Directory module for the same thing. Set ADACL, the distinguished name of the object, which would be this, the principal, which would be student X. And by default, it uses all the rights. So we can specify rights all or nothing at all with verbosity turned on. So let's try this one. Why? Because of the Active Directory module. And or we can have a look at both of these. But there is no difference in the final result. So let's import the module, the AD module, first the DLL, and then the module as well, and then the ACL script, set ADACL. Now if I run this, right, okay, this needs to be executed as a domain admin, right? So we need to do all of it again here. Let me copy that so that it's a bit faster. So let's exit this one. This is the DA. So we import the AD module, DLL, the module, and the script. And finally, the command once again. So what we did here, we read the existing ACL and then simply added a generic all ACL for the student 1. So I copied it, that's why it was student 1. Let's do it for student admin as well. Right now, we would like to run the propagation remotely. So for that, once again, we are going to use our favorite PowerShell remoting utilities. So let's create a new PS session to the domain controller. Right now, using invoke command, we will load this script invoke as the propagator in the session. So invoke as the propagator in the session $sys, and then we use enter ps session $sys. So invoke as the propagator has been loaded here. Show progress. Timeout in minute 1. Right. So what happens now? Whatever changes we made, that is, we made student admin to have full control over the administrative holder and hence all the protected groups. So once we have that, now please keep in mind that other than the full control, we can always have reset password or write member sort of functionalities or permissions as well. Once we have whatever we have, uh, we propagate it, and then let's first check it. Let's use the get object ACL to check the ACLs of the domain admin group and see if the propagation or our attack was successful, right? So using power view, let's run this one. So what we are reading, we are reading the ACL of the domain admins. This is how we read ACEs. This is how we learn to read ACEs. Object DN is domain admins, that is on domain admin. Dcorp student 1 has generic or full control rights, right? Simply same way we can go for student admin and see if both of the permissions or both of the ACs were entered right. So student admin also has full control over the domain admins group. Now, how do we abuse it? Once again from the command line, let's say all the ones the adding a group member to the domain and the adding a member to the domain admins is not recommended, but just for the sake of showing what we can do with the full control, let's try this. So from power view dev or from the active directory module, let's use this. We can actually add a group to the domain, add a user to the domain admins group. So get AD user identity test DA. So there is a user called test DA, but it is not a member the of the domain admin group yet. Let's check that, although we have seen that already. But let's see that domain admins. So there are just two members right now. If I run this, let's run it with verbosity turned on. The user test DA is now a member of the domain admins group, right? So this way we can add or remove users at our will from the domain admins group. Now, if we have the reset password permission, if we try to abuse the reset password permission, we can reset password for any domain admin at our will, right? There is no need to even add a new user to the domain admins group. So that is also possible, right? So that was all about the admin SD holder. Once again, what we did, admin SD holder was required to, or was designed to protect tampering with the ACLs of the protected groups, but there is no protection for the ACL of the admin SD holder itself. So we modified the ACL of the admin SD holder, which was then overwritten for all the protected groups, which provides us very interesting opportunities. All right. Uh, you will like to keep in mind that we are using domain admins as an example. You may always like to not go for domain admins, but other interesting protected groups which we discussed, right? If you really want to add new members to a group, right? So this was about admin SD holder, but we are not done with persistence using ACLs. There are even more interesting ACLs which can be abused. For example, there is an ACL for the domain object itself, right? We can modify with domain admin privileges, we can modify the ACL of the domain object itself, and then we can have interesting rights like full control over the domain object or the ability to run the DC sync attack, etc. So what is the domain object? This is the domain object, and it has its own ACL right here. So with domain admin privileges, we can simply go here, add student admin, and provide ourselves full control. Now, having full control over the domain object is interesting, but that is something which may be easily spotted, right? Uh, Especially because there is a default logging for modifications to the domain object, right? So someone looking at a full control log on the domain object, that may not be something which we want, right? We will like to stay a lot more silent. So for that we can add the ability to run DC sync. How we can do that? We can do that with the so how do we add full control? Quite similar to what we did for admin SD holder. We just provide the DN of uh, the domain object, and we would be fine, right? Or we can add DC sync rights. So let's first have a look at what DC sync rights look like. Let's say we want to provide the student admin user enough privileges so that it can run the DC sync without being uh, a domain admin. So if we scroll down here, there are three special rights which are required to DC sync, right? These are read directory, replicating directory changes all, and replicating directory changes in filtered set. Only these three rights are enough for someone to have DC sync privileges. So if we provide student admin these three privileges, we can run DC sync using student admin or whatever user we add anytime without having to escalate our privileges to DA. Wouldn't that be very interesting, right? Why? Recall that while discussing the golden ticket rule, golden ticket attack, we discussed DC sync, that we can extract credentials of Kirby TGT using DC sync without having to run any code onto the domain controller, right? That is true here as well. So now what we are going to do, we are going to have a look at the command line options to provide student admin privileges to run DC sync without domain admin. So here, once with the domain admin privileges, we are still in the persistence part. So we would at least once we would have the domain admin privileges. So 6 months back, you ran this set ADACL on the domain controller uh, and added DC sync rights for the student admin by modifying the ACL of the domain object. This was 6 months back, right? Uh, so we said DC sync, but it still says generic all. That we'll see. So once we have run this, this should provide us the capability to execute DC sync without having domain admin privileges. That means if we go here and check if we have the domain admin privileges, access denied. But if we try to run the DC sync attack, we can run that. Isn't this wonderful, right? This means that we can escalate our privileges at will. And please keep in mind that generally DC sync is used for the Kirby TGT account. Why? Because this is the most static hash. But that does not mean that we cannot use it for other users, right? So use it for the for any user you want, and you would be pleasantly surprised how easy it is to extract the hashes. Right? This is for the domain admin. So this is how we can run the DC sync attack by modifying the ACL of the domain object, right? Right here. And although there it said that it was generic all, probably the verbose message was wrong, but here you can see that we have just three privileges, right? Let's remove this. And now if we try this after removing it, we can't do that, right? So this is how we abuse ACLs in the domain. There are so many other options we'll touch on or we'll discuss ACLs or not ACLs, full control. Yeah, ACLs. ACLs on other user objects later on when we discuss about targeted kernel roasting, etc. For admin ST holder and the domain object root, this was all of it, right? So this brings us to our next learning objective. You need to check if student X has replication or DC sync rights. Student X, once again, if you are user 11, this will be student 11. If the rights are there, execute the DC sync attack to pull hashes of the CoBTGT user. If no, add the replication rights for the not for the student 1, but add the replication rights for student X, and then execute the DC sync attack to pull the hashes of the CoBTGT user, or for that matter, any user of your choice. Right, so that would be all for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you like it.